The number 12 did not mean what it means now. In the modern world, a 12-year-old is in middle school. They are learning pre-algebra and arguing about screen time and navigating the social complexities of early adolescence with a particular intensity that makes everyone around them slightly exhausted. They are, by legal definition and by near universal social consensus, a child. The idea that a 12-year-old could or should become a parent is not just frowned upon in modern societies, it is criminalized, pathologized, and treated as one of the clearest markers of abuse and developmental harm. And yet for most of human history, in most human cultures, across most of the span of our species' existence, the transition to parenthood occurred at ages that would trigger child protection services in any modern country. Not because ancient humans were monsters, not because they didn't care about their children's well-being, but because the entire framework within which age, development, reproduction, and social maturity operate was radically different from anything modern people experience. Understanding why ancient humans became parents so young requires dismantling several assumptions that modern people carry about what puberty means, what adulthood means, what childhood is for, and what the relationship between biology and culture actually looks like when you trace it back far enough. Let's go through it properly. Start with the biology, because the biology has not changed, and that is one of the most important facts in this entire story. The human body does not know what year it is. It does not know about compulsory education or labor laws or the developmental psychology literature on adolescent brain maturation. The human reproductive system matures according to a biological schedule that was calibrated by millions of years of evolution under conditions that have essentially nothing in common with modern life. And under those ancestral conditions, the biological schedule made sense. Female puberty in modern, well-nourished populations typically begins between ages 8 and 13, with menarche occurring on average around age 12 to 13. Male puberty typically begins between 9 and 14. These are the modern numbers in modern conditions. The onset of puberty is substantially influenced by nutrition, body fat percentage, stress, and environmental factors. In populations with lower average caloric intake and higher physical demands, conditions that characterized essentially all of human prehistory, puberty tended to occur somewhat later than in modern well-nourished populations. But the difference was measured in months, not years. This means that the basic biological capacity for reproduction has been present in young teenagers throughout human evolutionary history. The biology is not the question. The question is what happened socially, culturally, and practically around that biological capacity, and why the answers were so different from modern norms. Now let's talk about life expectancy, because this is the factor that most directly explains why ancient humans could not afford to delay reproduction the way modern humans do. The phrase life expectancy is deeply misleading when applied to ancient populations. When historians or archaeologists report that average life expectancy in a pre-modern population was 35 years, most people interpret this to mean that ancient adults typically died in their mid-30s. This interpretation is wrong, and the error matters enormously for understanding ancient reproductive patterns. Average life expectancy in ancient populations was dramatically lowered by extremely high infant and child mortality. A significant proportion of children, estimates for pre-modern populations range from 30 to 50%, died before their 5th birthday. Many more died between 5 and 15. When you average these early deaths into the calculation, the resulting number is a life expectancy at birth of 35 years, even if most adults who survived childhood lived into their 50s and 60s. What this means is that the relevant metric is not life expectancy at birth, but life expectancy conditional on surviving to reproductive age. An ancient human who survived to age 15 had reasonable prospects of living to 50 or 60, not dramatically different from modern humans in terms of absolute years of adult life available. But those years were not guaranteed. Disease, accident, famine, violence, the mortality risks that killed children at high rates did not disappear at adulthood. They continued throughout life, at rates substantially higher than modern populations experience. The practical implication is that delay in reproduction was delay in a context of genuine uncertainty about whether reproduction would be possible later. A 15-year-old in an ancient population who chose to delay reproduction until 25 was making a gamble that they would still be alive and healthy in 10 years, that their potential partner would be alive, that the social and environmental conditions that made reproduction viable would persist. Ancient mortality rates meant that gamble had worse odds than it appears from a modern perspective. Now let's talk about what childhood was actually for in ancient societies, because the modern concept of childhood as a protected developmental period distinct from adult life is historically recent and culturally specific. The idea that children should spend the years between roughly 6 and 18 in formal education, protected from adult responsibilities, provided with leisure time for play and development, and gradually prepared for adulthood through a structured institutional process. This idea is approximately 200 years old in its fully developed form. It is a product of industrialization, compulsory education laws, child labor legislation, and the specific economic conditions of industrial and post-industrial societies where childhood education is necessary preparation for adult economic participation. In pre-industrial societies, which includes virtually all of human prehistory, childhood looked fundamentally different. Children began contributing to household and group economies from very early ages. By age 6 or 7, children in forager and early agricultural societies were gathering plant foods, carrying water, caring for younger siblings, tending small animals, and performing the dozens of small tasks that contributed meaningfully to household survival. By early adolescence, they were performing adult-level work: hunting, farming, weaving, building, caring for children. This early productive participation meant that the transition to adult social roles, including parenthood, was not a sudden leap across a wide gap, but a gradual increase in responsibility and capability. A 13-year-old in an ancient agricultural society had been working alongside adults for 7 years. They had practical competence in the survival skills of their community. They knew how to grow food, prepare food, manage a household, and care for children. Because they had been doing all of these things at gradually increasing levels of responsibility since early childhood, the developmental gap between adolescence and adulthood that modern societies experience, and that modern developmental psychology has extensively documented, is partly a product of the specific conditions of modern life. The human brain is still maturing into the mid-20s in specific executive function regions, and this is a real biological fact. But ancient societies did not wait for full prefrontal cortex development before assigning adult roles because they could not afford to, and because the specific adult roles their members needed to perform did not require the same cognitive profiles as modern adult roles. Now let's talk about what marriage and partnership actually meant in ancient and traditional societies. Because the assumption that ancient early marriage was equivalent to modern early marriage, two individuals forming an independent household together, is another significant error. In most traditional societies, marriage was not primarily an individual relationship between two people. It was an alliance between families, managed by families, embedded in extended family networks that provided substantial support for child-rearing. A 13-year-old who married in an ancient agricultural society was not typically setting up an independent household with a partner of similar age. They were entering a kinship structure in which mothers-in-law, grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and other experienced women provided the actual childcare knowledge and physical assistance that allowed infant survival. This matters because the developmental concerns about young parenthood, the lack of emotional maturity, the incomplete knowledge of infant care, the economic vulnerability, were substantially mitigated by the family support structures that surrounded young parents in traditional societies. The young mother was not alone with an infant. She was embedded in a multi-generational female support network whose primary function included exactly the transmission of child-rearing knowledge and practical assistance that isolated young mothers in modern societies lack. The grandmother hypothesis, the evolutionary anthropology framework that explains the uniquely long post-reproductive human lifespan, is directly relevant here. Grandmothers in traditional societies provided food, childcare, and accumulated knowledge that measurably improved the survival of their grandchildren. The extended family structure that made early marriage sustainable was not a compensation for developmental inadequacy. It was the evolved social infrastructure within which human reproduction was designed to occur. Now let's talk about what the evidence actually shows about the range of reproductive ages across human history, because the picture is more varied and more nuanced than the simple narrative of universal early marriage suggests. The archaeological evidence for ancient reproductive ages is indirect but informative. Skeletal analysis can estimate age at death, and in females can sometimes identify obstetric history through specific bone changes associated with pregnancy and childbirth. This evidence suggests substantial variation in age at first reproduction across different ancient populations and different time periods. Hunter-gatherer populations, in particular, did not universally reproduce at the youngest possible ages. By the way, If you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the most studied contemporary forager populations, the average age at first birth is approximately 19 years. Among the San of southern Africa, it is approximately 19 to 20. These are not modern populations following modern norms. They are populations whose lifestyle most closely approximates the ancestral human foraging baseline, and their reproductive ages are substantially later than the 12-year extreme that the video title invokes. The populations where very young reproduction was most common were typically agricultural societies, specifically societies with intensive agriculture that created food surpluses, increased population density, and created social structures that motivated early marriage for economic and alliance reasons. The association between agriculture and early marriage is well documented cross-culturally and historically, and the motivations were often explicitly economic rather than simply biological. Now let's talk about those economic motivations, because understanding why families in agricultural societies pushed for early marriage illuminates a completely different aspect of the early parenthood question. In agricultural societies, children were labor assets. They worked the farm. They contributed to household production from early ages. And daughters, specifically, were often economic resources that could be leveraged through marriage alliances with other families. A daughter's marriage created a bond between two families, potentially sealing economic partnerships, resolving disputes, creating obligations of mutual support. The younger the daughter at marriage, the longer the alliance would endure. The earlier the marriage, the sooner the daughter's reproductive capacity began producing grandchildren who would inherit and extend the family's agricultural holdings. These economic calculations were not secret or unconscious. They were explicit features of marriage negotiation in agricultural societies across cultures and historical periods. The bride price, the dowry, the elaborate negotiation of marriage terms. These were economic transactions, and the age of the bride and groom were variables in those transactions, sometimes subject to negotiation, and sometimes fixed by custom. This economic framing of early marriage is uncomfortable from a modern perspective. And it should be. The treatment of young girls as economic assets to be strategically deployed through marriage is a form of exploitation that has caused genuine harm across human history and continues to cause harm in the contemporary world where child marriage persists. Understanding the historical logic of a practice is not endorsing the practice. It is a necessary step toward understanding why it was so widespread and why it has been so difficult to eliminate. Now let's talk about something that is rarely addressed in discussions of ancient reproductive patterns, but that the cross-cultural and historical evidence makes surprisingly clear: the substantial variation in how different traditional societies defined the threshold between childhood and adulthood, and what that variation reveals about how much of the early parenthood story is cultural construction rather than biological inevitability. Not all traditional societies treated biological puberty as the threshold for adult status and reproductive readiness. Many societies had extended periods between biological puberty and social adulthood, periods marked by specific initiation processes, learning requirements, or social rituals that had to be completed before full adult status and marriage eligibility were conferred. These transitional periods were not equivalent to the modern concept of adolescence as a protected developmental phase, but they were also not simple immediate transitions from child to adult at the moment of first menstruation or first beard growth. The length and content of these transitional periods varied substantially. In some societies, initiation was brief, a few days of ceremony that marked the transition. In others, it extended over months or years of specific learning, service, or ordeal that demonstrated the readiness for adult roles. The content of the initiation often directly addressed the specific knowledge and social relationships that adult roles required, teaching young men hunting skills, teaching young women agricultural or domestic skills, establishing the social relationships with elders that would support the young adult through the early years of family formation. This variation demonstrates that even in societies without modern concepts of developmental psychology, there was widespread recognition that biological capacity for reproduction did not automatically translate into social readiness for the full responsibilities of adult family life. The specific forms this recognition took varied enormously. The underlying recognition was nearly universal. Now let's talk about child survival rates and how they shaped reproductive strategy at the population level, because the decision to reproduce early was not made only by individuals calculating their personal odds. It was shaped by the population-level reality that many children would not survive, and that replacement required sustained, early, and repeated reproduction. In environments where 30 to 50% of children died before age 5, and where further mortality continued through childhood and adolescence, a family that delayed reproduction and had fewer children was statistically likely to end up with fewer surviving descendants than a family that began reproduction early and had more children in total. This is not a moral calculation. It is an arithmetic one. The mathematics of population replacement under high child mortality conditions favor early and frequent reproduction, and the social norms around early marriage in agricultural societies were partly shaped by this demographic reality. The shift away from early marriage in modern populations correlates almost precisely with declining child mortality rates. As infant and child survival improved through the 19th and 20th centuries, the demographic pressure toward early and frequent reproduction diminished. Families could be smaller and begin later and still reliably produce surviving descendants. The biology did not change. The demographic environment changed, and the social norms followed. Now let's talk about what has changed to make early reproduction not just socially unacceptable, but genuinely harmful in modern contexts. Because the argument that ancient early marriage was adaptive does not imply that modern early parenthood is equivalent or acceptable. The conditions that made early reproduction adaptive in ancient contexts are absent in modern ones. The extended family support networks that provided childcare knowledge and practical assistance to young mothers in traditional societies are typically absent for young parents in modern industrial societies. The economic contribution of children that made large families with early first births economically rational in agricultural societies is absent in modern economies, where children are economically costly rather than economically productive. The educational requirements of modern economic participation mean that interrupting schooling for parenthood and adolescence has lifetime economic consequences that have no equivalent in pre-industrial societies. The human brain's developmental timeline has not changed. The prefrontal cortex still matures into the mid-20s. The emotional regulation, the long-term planning capacity, the full suite of executive functions that stable parenthood benefits from, these are still developing in adolescence. In ancient societies, this developmental incompleteness was compensated for by social structures. In modern societies, those compensating social structures are largely absent. The result is that what was adaptive in ancient contexts is genuinely harmful in modern ones. Not because the biology has changed, but because the social context has changed so completely that the biological facts operate in an entirely different environment. Now let's talk about what the actual experience of early parenthood looked like in traditional societies, beyond the structural and demographic analysis, because the human experience of becoming a parent at a young age in an ancient context was something specific and particular that deserves direct attention. Young mothers in traditional societies were not alone with their infants in the way that modern isolated nuclear family structures can make parenthood feel. They were embedded in female social networks that gathered around birth and continued throughout the early years of child-rearing. Older women who had birthed and raised children provided direct instruction, physical assistance, and emotional support that was structural rather than optional. The knowledge required to keep an infant alive, to breastfeed successfully, to manage the minor medical emergencies of early infancy, to read infant behavioral signals and respond appropriately, was transmitted through this social network rather than through individual maternal instinct or formal education. Young fathers in traditional societies were similarly embedded in male social networks where the skills of food provision and family protection were transmitted through ongoing apprenticeship relationships with older men. The transition to fatherhood was a social transition supported by community recognition and practical mentorship, not an individual achievement managed in isolation. The community recognition of parenthood, the ceremonies, the social status changes, the explicit acknowledgement that this individual had taken on a new and important role, provided psychological scaffolding for young parents that modern society does not systematically provide. Becoming a parent in a traditional society meant becoming a different kind of person in the community's eyes, with a new set of obligations and a new set of supports. The social meaning of parenthood was clear, public, and actively maintained by the community. And this is ultimately what the answer to the question in the title looks like. Ancient humans became parents young because biology created the capacity early, because mortality made delay genuinely risky, because the social and economic structures of pre-modern life integrated young people into adult roles gradually from childhood, because extended family networks provided the support that developmental incompleteness made necessary, because child mortality rates created demographic pressure toward early and frequent reproduction, and because the specific conditions of modern life that make early parenthood harmful were simply absent. The 12-year-old parent in the ancient world was not the equivalent of a 12-year-old parent in a modern city. The biology was similar. The social context was so different as to make the comparison almost meaningless. What the comparison does illuminate is how profoundly social conditions shape what biology makes possible, what culture makes normal, and what experience makes survivable. The biology of reproduction has not changed in 300,000 years. The world that biology operates in has changed beyond recognition. The gap between those two facts is where the entire history of human reproductive culture lives. A history that is not a story of ignorance gradually replaced by wisdom, but of different solutions to different problems in different environments, each of which made sense in its context, even when it looks incomprehensible from outside it. The number 12 did not mean the same thing then. Neither did parent. Neither did childhood, and understanding why those words meant different things is how you understand why people in the past made choices that look incomprehensible from where we are standing now.